Not for profit, not for a view, not for the future. He bought it because the past wouldn't stop following him through marble hallways and glass-walled offices, through the soft applause of shareholders and the empty echo of victory. He had the money. He had the company. He had the city in his calendar and the markets in his pocket. But he did not have silence. So he drove into rain that seemed intent on erasing everything, turned a steel key in a rusted lock, and stepped into a shack that smelled of wet wood and surrendered time. The key was still trembling in his hand when the sound found him. Thin, urgent, muffled. Not the wind, not the roof's steady drip, not the ratchet of storms. It was human. It was a cry trying not to be a cry. The beam of a phone flashlight cut through dust like a blade, and the room offered up its truth. Not emptiness, but life pressed into shadows. A young mother, shoulders squared against a world that had no patience for her, cradled two infants in an embrace that was both shelter and promise. Cold clung to her. Hunger whispered in the tremor of tiny breasts. Fear had learned her name, but courage had set its hands on her back and refused to let her fall. He stood very still. The mind that had once reorganized an industry tried to reorganize this. Flooded eyes, thin blanket, milk long gone, a wet roof counting seconds. Grief, which had been a fog around him for 6 months, shifted and showed a sharp edge. Behind its veil lived a memory of another woman, a partner who had filled their home with purpose, and the fight for those the world held at arm's length. Loss had made the world sound distant. Now it rang with a clarity that hurt. The rain thickened, the shack exhaled, and the story inside that room unfolded, not with speeches, but with facts that had cut through one life after another. A city that sold itself as enlightened, a system that praised itself as immaculate, a hospital whose glossy lobby did not reach the night shift, wealth that moved like weather behind closed doors, a pattern of endings that arrived too neatly for coincidence, too profitably for compassion. Elderly patients who signed new wills and then failed to see another sunrise. Paper trails that tried to look like smoke. Night call decisions that could be made, undone, denied, buried, and paid. A nurse's badge revoked, a name blacklisted, locks changed, calls unanswered, doors quietly shut, reputations adjusted until help could not find a path. Twins expected, then weaponized against their mother by a world that had chosen speed over care. At the center of it, a physician who treated power like a scalpel and oath like a costume. Around him, an investment shell for laundering the aftermath into opportunity. Beyond them, a developer with maps that colored neighborhoods like targets. And somewhere in the weave, another thread. A car in the rain on a night like this one, a journalist's report waiting to be finished, brakes that should not have failed. A list of names that had been too inconvenient to leave breathing. The shack held its breath. The rain said nothing. The storm outside could not outmatch the one that gathered in him then. Grief lifted its mask and became mission. Money had first been leverage. Now it would become light. He closed his eyes and saw a boardroom of men who loved consequence only when it belonged to someone else. He opened them and saw a young woman who loved her children more than fear. In the space between those visions, resolve took root. The ruin transformed, not instantly, not with magic, with heaters and cables and quiet deliveries that arrived at midnight, with a crib that made the room look like a promise, not a refuge, with 3 laptops humming like engines, with a table tattooed by printed spreadsheets and names underlined until the paper thinned, with a browser that never slept and a secure connection that did not blink, with a rhythm that pushed through exhaustion, feed, code, cross-reference, rock the babies, verify, listen, hold steady, repeat. Data tells a story when you force it to live in the same room. And the numbers began to confess. There were deposits timed like drum beats, 48 hours after death, a transfer. There were wills altered with sudden precision, witnessed by signatures that appeared often enough to be habits. There were property records that whispered a secret migration, homes in valuable districts traveling to a single developer's portfolio after estates changed hands in the quietest hours. There were names that kept reuniting in meetings, emails, filings, parties, boards, A physician, a chief, a lawyer, an executive, a man who built towers, a politician who loved ribbon cuttings. They looked unrelated from far away. They were a machine from up close. There were other nurses too, other cities, the same pattern, repeated until the pattern itself became the point. Some had evidence, some had fear, some had both. Truth had been scattered, now it began to assemble. In the shack, the light from 3 screens turned the cold into resolve. The infant slept. The mother traced fields of numbers like terrain she had learned to navigate in the dark. The man who had fled to the edge of the map realized he had just found the center. He called people who had earned more than paychecks. A defender with a spine made of case law and sleepless nights. An investigator who could read a city's veins by its bank statements. They walked into the shack with eyebrows raised and left with jaws set. The plan they wrote could not rely on outrage. Outrage is loud and easily ignored. It would rely on architecture, of proof, of sequence, of airtight inevitability. They would not kick a door. They would render it unnecessary. Meanwhile, the machine they had disturbed stirred. Messages arrived that mistook intimidation for strategy. Warnings dressed as friendly advice. A drone that hovered too near the roofline and carried the arrogance of men who believe they can control the very sky. The shack became smaller, not with fear, but with urgency. Timelines adjusted, contingencies multiplied. Backups backed up twice. Silence in the morning, noise at night. Evidence thickened to the point of gravity. A recording of hands administering what charts had not ordered. A ledger where the bloodless math of incentive met the warmth of human names and extinguished it. Transfers labeled blandly next to the dates of funerals. Internal emails in which euphemism did most of the work while intent did the rest. A map where red pins turned into a corridor of profit that matched the blueprints of gentrification dressed as renewal. And in the middle of the map, a memory of a car, a rain-slick road, brakes that did not break. He stared at that memory until it became more than grief. He had once believed the world ran on reason. He now saw how much of it ran on audacity. But there is another audacity, the kind that refuses to cede reality to cruelty. He would own the day. He would own the room. He would own what they feared most, exposure that could not be purchased, bargained with, or made to vanish. The date was chosen, the hour fixed. The stage was not a courtroom and not a network studio. It was their world, an administrative floor where polished stone and frosted glass were meant to intimidate the uninvited. The machine's architects collected under recessed lighting, disguised as respectability. Suits crisp enough to cut. Watches that measured time like it belonged to them. Eyes that had practiced gravitas until it looked almost like conscience. He arrived without noise but with weight. The weight of the evidence, the team at his shoulders, the young mother whose courage had preceded this day by months and years. The investigator moved like a metronome between screens and files. The defender had the calm of someone who had memorized the route from fact to verdict. They did not ask for permission to begin. They did not request an audience. They brought the audience with them. The stream went live, not to a trickle of curious onlookers, but to a flood. Employees, families, nurses who had whispered to each other in break rooms, citizens who felt something was wrong but could not name it, officials too cautious to act alone, and strangers who simply knew that truth hates a closed door. The company's own platforms carried it. The city shared it with itself. In minutes, it was everywhere a screen could glow. Screens on the conference table turned from mirrors into windows. The first window showed a night shift scene that had grown too common. A bedside, a syringe, a hand that did not match the order log. The second window showed the ledger that followed each death with the same silent ceremony. A transfer labeled consult, stipend, retainer, appreciation, euphemisms arranged like flowers. The third window opened into property records where grief transformed into square footage and then into towers, where neighborhoods were moved like chess pieces, where the living learned to live elsewhere. It was not spectacle, it was sequence. Names, dates, amounts, faces in a boardroom captured by a phone camera at a private meeting that was never truly private. a developer's outline leaning over a table, an executive nodding at a suggestion that had never had a chance to be ethical, a chief signing a policy that carried teeth only when they bit the powerless, and then a fourth window, a car at a gas station under a rain-blurred camera, a man with a mechanic's certainty, hands where they should not be, a license plate, a timestamp, a contract from a company that never did business with hospitals but always seemed to orbit them, a sequence of incidents in other cities, other rainy nights, other sudden funerals, a list of investigators whose curiosity had been labeled hazardous by those who profit from darkness. The room changed shape. Gloss lifted and revealed corrosion. Some eyes hardened into defiance. Others cracked into panic. The stream did not care. It registered reaction and then continued, indifferent in its fidelity to order. The defender annotated quietly, criminal statutes, civil liabilities, regulatory violations. A lattice that fit the facts like a lock accepts a key. The investigator overlaid the final layer, the path from motive to method to money. The young mother stood like a lighthouse, proof that truth can survive storms long enough to guide others home. Elsewhere in the building, officers moved with timing, learned from long lessons in disappointment. Warrants had already been signed, accounts already frozen, licenses already flagged. The stream had not been a warning, it had been an announcement. The walls had ears. Now they also had eyes. The machine tried to bargain with the only currency it understood, importance. It tried to summon an old magic, connections. It spoke the language of men who had grown used to being told yes before they asked. But the city had changed without telling them. It had learned how to recognize theater and how to reject it. It had learned the extent to which profit can be trained to imitate virtue. It had learned how loud a quiet, meticulous truth can be when it finally enters the room. Handcuffs do not look like justice to everyone. To some, they look like humiliation. But to the families who watched, to the nurses who had been told they were imagining patterns, to the neighborhoods that had been treated like clay for someone else's sculpture, they looked like gravity finally remembering where to pull. After, the stream quieted to comments and then to memory. The building that had once hummed with self-congratulation, hummed with questions whose answers would all begin in court. The man who had bought a ruin to vanish returned to the shack not to hide but to exhale. In a crib beside a space heater, two infants slept through a thunder that had just rolled across the region. The days that followed were not cinema, they were work. Testimony, filings, calls, interviews. Threats mutated into apologies, then into statements about systemic failures, then into silence. A city budget found money for oversight. A licensing board found its purpose and its courage. An industry learned the difference between accountability and optics. And beneath the churn of institutions, two lives rebuilt themselves. Not into a myth of rescue, but into a partnership forged by clarity. Grief does not vanish when justice arrives. It finds a place to sit. The man who had once worn success like armor now wore purpose like marrow. The mother who had once been told to disappear began to teach institutions how to see. The shack that had held fear became a house that held a foundation and a promise. Walls straightened, windows opened, the roof stopped counting rain. The ruin learned to shelter. Years passed the way good years do, busy and luminous. A platform launched that allowed truth to travel safely from terrified hands to places that could protect it. It did not break every conspiracy, but it broke enough to change the weather. Grants flowed not to those with the best friends, but to those with the best evidence. Clinics learned that reputation begins at the front desk. Hospitals learned that night shifts are where ethics are tested, not merely declared. Real estate learned that neighborhoods are not assets, they are ecosystems. City Hall learned that ribbon cuttings do not absolve complicity. Some endings wrote themselves across headlines. Sentences were long enough to matter. Assets were liquidated and reassembled into restitution. Memorial funds grew. Scholarships were renamed. There was tragedy too. One of the architects of the machine chose a final exit rather than a long corridor of accountability. Another clutched his chest in a courtroom built for public memory. A third retired to a life that suddenly did not respect him back. None of it undid what had been done. But the city, calloused and skeptical, felt something it had not felt in a long time. consequence that did not skip the powerful. In the house that had once been a shack, mornings began with the domestic noise of hope. Small feet, laughter, cereal on a table nicked by constant use. The foundation's name on the mailbox looked less like branding and more like a prayer answered. The living room transformed into a war room often enough to keep its spirit honest. On the wall a photograph hung, a woman smiling in rain, eyes fierce with purpose. She was gone, but her fight was not. The man who loved her had learned that love can be militant without becoming cruel. He stood sometimes in the yard at dusk, the city's distant pulse folded into the trees, and considered the shape of revenge. The young often imagine it as destruction, as spectacle, as the moment when the hurt flips and becomes the power. But he had learned what the oldest stories tried to tell all along. The most devastating revenge is not a ruin. It is a rebuilding that leaves the architects of harm locked outside, staring through the glass at a world they cannot enter again. Revenge burns. Justice builds. One lasts longer. The infants became children who asked big questions and gave small, generous answers. The mother became a guardian of ethics with authority that came not from a badge alone, but from battle scars. The defender took on new cases with the same steady fury. The investigator continued to draw lines between things that insisted on being called unrelated. The city sent letters, donations, tips, thanks, and sometimes apologies. The house learned how to hold all of that. On anniversaries, the yard grew quiet. There are dates that sit in the calendar like stones. Memory thickened. Gratitude rose like warmth. Purpose sharpened. There were tears never ashamed to appear. There was laughter, too, because it honors what was loved. The photograph on the wall seemed to nod, the rain in the image forever falling, forever baptizing. If anyone asked how the storm had truly turned, the answer was not mystical. It was a method. Listen to the person the system has decided not to hear. Move proof from vulnerable hands into indestructible places. Build teams that do not require applause to stay brave. Choose daylight even when darkness is more comfortable. Distribute the risk so no one person must hold it all. Write the plan so carefully that even cowardice cannot find a flaw to hide behind. Then act, and act again, and again. The city will forget parts of this story because cities must forget in order to function. The archive will remember. So will the families with checks that cannot bring anyone back, but can pay mortgages and tuition and grief counselors. So will the nurses who know that policy is only as strong as the first minute after it is needed. So will the neighborhoods that now name their blocks after those who kept them safe not by force, but by truth. And as for the man who once drove through rain to erase himself, he learned that you cannot outrun pain, but you can force it to pull a plow. He learned that wealth that refuses the work of justice is just an expensive costume. He learned that the most radical line in any balance sheet is the one that adds a human being back to the sum. He learned that he had not bought a ruin to hide. He had bought a frontier to build from. When the voice telling this story finally quiets, let the last images remain. A door that does not need a lock because it finally has a community. A table covered with papers that will become protection for someone you will never meet. A child tracing letters on a window, fogged by breath and evening. A woman closing her eyes for one long moment and tasting peace. A man standing beside them and feeling, for the first time in too long, that the future is not a threat. If you must name a moral, do not make it pretty. Make it useful. Those who profit from the dark will always underestimate how patient the light can be. Power that sneers at the defenseless is only rehearsing its fall. The most lethal weapon in a corrupt world is not fury, it is evidence. The cleanest victory is not a spectacle, it is the blueprint that ensures there will be no encore. And the best revenge is not to break what broke you, it is to build something unbreakable and invite the whole wounded world inside.